Good morning, everyone. Mark Bowden is a best-selling author and journalist who has written over the years on just about everything under the sun, from Abe Lincoln to pro football to his failure to raise a respectable flock of guinea fowl. He is best known as the author of Black Hawk Down, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in 2000, and which, more important to many of you, was made into a big Academy Award-winning film by the same name. He has written 13 books in all, the most recent of which, Hue, 1968, about a battle in Vietnam, will be published in June. Bowden's books and articles have won many awards and have been translated into a dozen or more foreign languages. Mark teaches part-time at the University of Delaware, where he's a writer in residence, which he says is about as good a gig as you can pull off without breaking the law. He is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and a national correspondent for The Atlantic, a reporter and columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer for more than 30 years. He lives in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, with his wife, Gail. They have 5 grown children and 2 granddaughters. I met Mark Bowden at a dinner party a few years back and was absolutely mesmerized as he recalled some of his adventures. Mark is truly a mensch. In other words, a really good man who works hard for what he believes in. I am sure you will enjoy his presentation today. Come on up, Mark.
A little bit taller. Well, thank you all very much for inviting me. I'm flattered to be asked. I know that Rotary is a great organization. I've crossed paths with it a number of times over the years. I think there's some of you in the audience whose faces I recognize. If my teenage boys ever did anything to you, please forgive me. And so, we're gathered here today in Gettysburg, which of course is the field of one of the most, if not the most important battle ever fought on American soil. And if you go on the tour today and try to imagine 165,000 soldiers, Confederate and Union, arrayed on the various battlefields that you see, it is truly, an exciting place to be. I have to say that I've been here often, partly because my dad loved battlefields and monuments, and I have 7 brothers and sisters, and he would throw us all in the car, and to him a 4 or 5 hour drive was just a short detour if it took him to some place that he thought was historically valuable. So my first few trips here, I can remember playing on the rocks at Devil's Den and having no clue as to what actually had happened here. I think when you do understand what happened here, it is quite moving, and it does give you a deep perspective on the history of your country. What happened here, in short, was that the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's army, marched north across Maryland and into Pennsylvania, trying to draw out Union troops and defeat them, and maybe even steal a march on Washington, D.C., and end the war once and for all. This was in the summer of 1863. It was a bold plan, and it failed. Plenty over the years, you can fill whole libraries with what's been written about this battle, about the choices that various leaders made that proved to either be disastrous or successful, in many cases choices that they came to regret. And like any battle, it affords a lot of very powerful lessons in how to lead effectively. You'll learn, for instance, today, if you go on the tour, I'm sure, about the Confederate General Jeb Stuart, who was one kind of leader. He was a very flamboyant gentleman. He liked to wear a gray cape with a red lining and a yellow sash. He wore his hat cocked to one side with a big ostrich plume in it, and he liked to have a red flower in his lapel. He would also douse himself with cologne, which was probably a smart thing to do, given that he was living in the saddle for most of the Civil War. But during the Battle of Gettysburg, this very dashing and flamboyant general took his cavalry and made an extremely bold ride all the way around the Union Army. In fact, he swung so far east, he almost got to Baltimore, and boasted later that if he'd wanted to, he could have ridden his troops right into Washington, D.C. and taken old Abe Lincoln prisoner. But the problem was that Jeb Stuart's cavalry was the eyes and ears for Robert E. Lee's army. And so while he was off on this incredibly bold and daring ride all around the Union Army, Robert E. Lee had nobody to tell him how large the force was that he was facing or where it was and how it was being deployed. So effectively, Stuart, in his ride, took away Robert E. Lee's eyes and ears on the eve of this enormous battle, and it had a disastrous effect. You'll hear about Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, a much more dour fellow from Maine, who led his men in defense of a little hilltop, which you'll probably see today, called Little Round Top. And they fought off wave after wave of Confederate attacks until they ran out of ammunition, and then they, at that point, charged with their bayonets and turned the tide in what proved to be one of the most dramatic moments and decisive moments in the battle. And you'll also hear about the famous George Pickett of Pickett's Charge, which has been portrayed many times in books and movies over the years as this very dramatic and heroic charge that his men made across an open field, which you'll see on the tour. It sounds great, but believe me, you would not have wanted to been in that charge. It was disastrous, and it was the move that finally broke the back of the Robert E. Lee's plans. So the fine points of this battle and the various characters involved have been dissected and criticized for a century and a half, and you find, as I said, memorable examples of good and bad leadership. But the leader for me, who actually most resonates with me and whom I find the most interesting, was not here. He was in Washington waiting by the telegraph machine, and he got news of the Union victory when the wire delivered Union General George Meade's congratulatory order to his armies. So the news was delivered, and then Meade's statement to his armies ended with the following words. He said that his forces, his men, had baffled an enemy with superior numbers, which in fact was not true. Meade had more men than Lee did. But he went on to say, but our task is not yet accomplished. We have to drive from our soil every vestige of the presence of the invader. Abe Lincoln read this, and his joy quickly turned to dismay. His hands dropped to his side, and in an anguished tone, he said, "Drive the invader from our soil?" All of America was our soil, north and south. That was what the battle and the war was about. Didn't Meade get it? Lincoln had labored hard to make everyone understand. The war was not a battle or a struggle between two rival nations. It was about the United States putting down a rebellion on its own soil, our soil. It was all our soil. That was the point. More importantly, Meade seemed to think that his goal was to drive Lee's hobbled army back across the Potomac and south of the Mason-Dixon line. Lincoln didn't want the army driven off. He wanted it destroyed. He read the dispatch with disbelief. "My God," he said, "is that all?" And he was right, because Robert E. Lee had lost 28,000 men, a third of his army. The Potomac, which he got stuck at, was still swollen with spring and summer rains, and so for days he couldn't cross. So he had his hobbled army bottled up next to the river, waiting for a way to find a way across, and basically they were sitting ducks. But Meade dallied, and Lincoln fumed, and the Army of Northern Virginia eventually found its way across the river. They marched back to Richmond and regrouped and retrenched, and the Civil War ground on for 2 more bloody years. For me, the real lesson in leadership, not just from this battle, but for the Civil War and for all time, is Abraham Lincoln. His conduct during those painful years offers lasting lessons in leadership that transcend the military maneuvers of any one battle. And I'll draw your attention to 3: vision, understanding, and strategy. Like all great leaders, Lincoln knew where he wanted to go. He had a vision. He had vision that transcended, actually, the ability of most of the people around him to see. He also had a deep understanding of the problem. He understood where he was. And this is a harder thing than you might think. Many leaders get so caught up in their theories or their vision of what the world is actually like or what the battlefield is actually like that they start to believe only those facts, only that intelligence which support their theories. And in fact, some begin to make up facts in order to fit what they already believe. Does that sound familiar to anyone? But Abraham Lincoln had a hard-headed grasp of what he actually faced. And he had a strategy. Lincoln knew how to win. He knew the politics a lot better than most people, and even better than the experienced generals who were serving under him. He understood very early on what it would take to defeat the Confederacy. First, let's talk about his vision, because I think this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Lincoln. He understood that the war may have been about many things, but it was first and foremost about preserving the Union, and he took a lot of heat for this. The secession happened because Lincoln and his supporters stood firm against the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. That's what started the war. And right from the beginning, abolitionists wanted Lincoln to seize the moment to end slavery for once and for all. But what Lincoln understood was the primacy of saving the Union. That and that alone was his first responsibility. If you read his first inaugural address, you'll see that he has no intention of interfering with slavery in states where it already exists. He said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Lincoln understood, as his abolitionist critics did not, that losing the Union meant perpetuating slavery. It wouldn't matter what he did about slavery if he lost the war. The institution would remain entrenched in the Confederacy, and there would be a competition for westward expansion, which would mean where the Confederacy won out, slavery would sink new roots. Losing the war meant that slavery would not just endure, it would spread. And here is where we see Lincoln's true brilliance. The Union cause, he understood, was even bigger than that. If you think this country is divided today, check out the 19th century. Lincoln saw very clearly that losing the Civil War meant the end of democracy itself, government of the people, for the people, by the people, as he put it here in his most famous speech, might perish from the earth. The United States of America in 1861 was a brand new experiment in self-governance. It had existed actually for less time than my mother has been alive. She'll be 92 next week. Most of the world in the 19th century was still ruled by monarchs. And if the South could secede, the game and the experiment of democracy was over. It meant that great experiment begun, as he put it, 77 years ago, was inherently unstable, because democracy means ultimately bending to the will of the majority. If any state or city or group can simply walk if it loses a vote, the breakdown is unstoppable. It leads straight to anarchy. During the Civil War, the state of North Carolina very nearly seceded from the Confederacy over an argument about conscription. So you see the trend once you begin to assert it, that you as an organization or as a county or as a state can decide you don't like what the majority has decided, you're going your own way. The whole fabric of the experiment breaks down. What would stop cities from seceding from states and neighborhoods from cities? And once the framework of a nation fractures, it'll keep on fracturing. Because in this life, you can never get even two people to completely agree about everything. This was something that Lincoln understood, and it explains why it was so important for him to insist that the Confederacy was not a nation, but a seditious conspiracy. He would not consider dealing directly with Jefferson Davis. Davis was not a rival, he was a rebel. So you can see after the Union won the battle here, Lincoln was dismayed to hear his top general boasting about chasing Robert E. Lee out of our soil. Lincoln's vision was clear. The war was first and foremost about preserving the Union and the idea of democracy itself. And this wasn't because Lincoln accepted slavery. He hated slavery his whole life. No one had spoken out about it more eloquently or more consistently. But when he finally did sign the Emancipation Proclamation, he explained it this way: "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not to either save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." The letter is often cited as evidence that Lincoln was not passionate about ending slavery, but he was, and ultimately he did. The first thing he secured after the Union's victory was the 13th Amendment to end slavery. And if you've seen Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln, it very dramatically shows the extraordinary efforts that Lincoln made to make that part of our law. So Lincoln had a vision and a goal, which a lot of his critics didn't get, but he also understood his situation far better than the people around him. He knew that the North was far better positioned to endure a long war than the South. They had more men, more resources, and better lines of communication and transportation. But in order to maintain these critical advantages, the Union could not afford to lose the border states: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kansas, and the Western Indian territories. If he lost those, the balance of advantage would shift to the South, not the North. And he couldn't afford to lose those states by outlawing slavery, because many of those border states had economies that rested in part on slavery. And once it became clear that he'd pulled it off, that the Union was going to win the war, as I said, the very first thing he did was to push to pass the 13th Amendment. But by waiting until the Union was safe, he was parting ways with many principled and impatient abolitionists, and he took torrents of abuse. I wrote a little article in the Atlantic a couple years ago called "Abe Lincoln Was an Idiot," which might attract your attention, and it spends some time pointing out the kinds of criticisms that were leveled at Abe Lincoln when he was in office. And if you think Presidents Obama and Trump have taken a beating in the White House, check out the things written about Lincoln, making fun of him, the fact that he was tall and he was dark and he was kind of ungainly. He had a very kind of rustic manner and a Western accent, because Illinois, believe it or not, was the West back then. He was called a barbarian, a gorilla, an ape, an orangutan, and an idiot, right? And in 1984, when he ran for re-election, newspapers, some of them weren't just editorializing for his defeat. They were editorializing for his assassination. Deeply divided country. Lincoln absorbed all of this abuse. He understood the lay of the land better than his critics did. And he knew not only what his goal was, but he knew how to get there, which brings us to the third point, which is strategy. I've already touched on his strategic thinking intellectually and politically, but what about what it would actually take to win the war? Lincoln had a military strategy, which is very surprising, given that his only military experience in his life had been to be a foot soldier in the Black Hawk War, where he went with an Illinois regiment. And he often used his experiences as a soldier in the Black Hawk War as the fodder for humorous tales, making fun of himself. That was the extent of his military experience. But when he was elected president, he started to devour books about military strategy. He went to town, and as we all know, Lincoln was completely self-taught. He's someone who never attended formal school. So when he set to work learning something, he really went at it. And almost from the start, this self-taught commander-in-chief had a better sense of how to defeat the Confederacy than any of his generals. The historian T. Harry Williams, in his it's a terrific book, it's called Lincoln and His Generals, he put it this way: Lincoln grasped immediately the advantage that numbers gave the North and urged his generals to keep up a constant pressure on the whole strategic line of the Confederacy until a weak spot was found and a breakthrough could be made. And he soon realized that the proper objective of his armies was the destruction of Confederate armies and not the occupation of Southern territory. You can see why he was so annoyed with Meade. And when he finally got the right generals in place, his strategy worked. I just finished, as Lynn mentioned, writing a book about the Battle of Hue in 1968 in Vietnam. It'll be out in bookstores in a few weeks. It's called Hue 1968. And it affords plenty of examples, similarly, of leadership, good and bad, and how these principles, three principles apply. General William Westmoreland was the supreme commander of all troops in Vietnam. And he had a very good sense of what his goals were. He had vision. He knew what the United States was trying to accomplish in Vietnam, but he had a terrible sense of reality. Despite the most sophisticated tools for intelligence gathering and surveillance, he had a tragically poor understanding of the battlefield. He was a smart man, and he could dazzle you with his meticulously thought out PowerPoint presentations of his plans for what the United States military was going to accomplish in Vietnam. But he was so wedded to his impressive theories that he downplayed or ignored intelligence that contradicted it, which explains how the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were able to secretly mass an army of more than 10,000 outside the city of Hue, which was the third largest city in South Vietnam. And on January 31st of 1968, the first night of Tet, they overran and seized the entire city. Hue is the traditional capital of the unified country of Vietnam and its cultural center. So this had huge significance in Vietnam, much larger than most Americans realized. It was a stunning coup. And what do you think Westmoreland did? He denied it. As far as he was concerned, it had not happened. The takeover of Hue could not be true, he reasoned, because the enemy, in his theory, simply lacked the ability to accomplish it. He immediately declared the enemy offensive a complete failure. He denied that Hue had been taken, and he didn't just deny it to the press as part of some masterful public relations strategy. He denied it in secret cables to the White House and to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you know what? I don't think he was lying. I think he genuinely was effective enough at denying things that he denied it to himself. In his bones, he just did not believe it had happened. And he denied it in spite of frantic reports from his own commanders in Hue, facing this enemy takeover. And this wasn't just some academic or public relations problem. Over the next few days, Westmoreland's commanders, reflecting his conviction that the city had not been taken, repeatedly hurled small groups of brave Marines and soldiers against a far superior, heavily entrenched enemy. And hundreds of young Americans were killed and thousands were wounded. Westmoreland had vision, but because he lacked a clear understanding of reality, his strategy became deadly to his own mission and ultimately his goal. There's an opposite example from this same battle. Ernie Cheatham is little known outside of the Marine Corps, but he deserves to be better known. He was a great leader and quite a character. At the time of Hue, he was a lieutenant colonel and a former NFL lineman. He'd played for both the Colts and the Steelers. In fact, today, he's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame as the highest-ranking service member to ever have played in the NFL. He was a giant of a man, Ernie Cheatham, who liked to play dumb, the blockhead former lineman, but he was usually the smartest man in the room. After the initial failures of the first 4 days, Cheatham was given the job of taking back Hue. Initially with limited resources, he genuinely did have, unlike Meade, fewer men than the enemy, and with only 1 day to prepare. So what did Cheatham do? He, unlike Westmoreland, who already believed that he knew everything he needed to know and was pretty good at ignoring information that contradicted it, Cheatham knew he did not know enough. So here's how Big Ernie assessed the situation. He didn't know how many enemy soldiers he was going to face. He didn't even know what kind of weapons or supply lines or support that they had. What he did know, the only thing he knew for sure, was where he was going to fight. Hue was a big city. It was different than any of the other conflicts fought in Vietnam. This is a built-up city, the third largest city in South Vietnam. And the last time the Marines had fought a battle in a city was in Seoul in Korea, back in like 1950, correct my date if I'm wrong, 53, I believe. So what Ernie did was he went hunting for Marine Corps manuals about how to fight, what sort of tactics worked in an urban environment. And he spent the whole night before he shipped off to Hue reading these manuals. The idea, he learned, was not to charge the ramparts, which is what Westmoreland's commanders had been ordering Marines in Hue to do for days. The idea was to flatten the buildings and structures that were hiding the enemy, completely destroy them, flush out the enemy, and then attack. So weather and battlefield restrictions denied Cheatham air power and heavy artillery. So he hunted up the biggest portable weapons he could find, 106 millimeter recoilless rifles, including a mini tank called an Ontos, which has 6 of these rifles on it. He rounded up mortars and tear gas firing platforms that could put up great clouds of tear gas. And he found stores of World War II era bazookas. These were long metal tubes that fired pretty big, heavy rockets. They were generally not used in Vietnam. They'd been replaced by disposable plastic tubes, which fired lighter weight shells. And they were called LAWs, light anti-tank weapons, LAWs, which were much easier to carry through the jungles and paddies. But they carried a lot less punch than bazookas. So Big Ernie arrived in Hue 4 days after it was taken with piles of bazookas and ammo, with the Ontos tanks and with his 106s and the tear gas launchers and the mortars. In effect, he created his own mobile artillery and set about pulverizing enemy positions 1 block at a time as his Marines advanced. It took them the rest of the month to take back the city, but they did. Cheatham might not have been as big on the vision thing as Westmoreland, but he had both of his big feet on the ground. He sorted out what he knew from what he didn't know, and he hit the books and improvised a strategy that worked. It's pretty much what Lincoln did in the Civil War. He was not a military man. He had no experience other than being a foot soldier, and so he taught himself military strategy. He had all three of these important qualities, I think, of leadership: vision, understanding, and strategy. He was also steady. He used to say about himself, "I am slow to learn and slow to forget that which I have learned. My mind is like a piece of steel, very hard to scratch anything on it, and almost impossible after you get it there to rub it out." Which is not to say that he was perfect. Lincoln was moody, and he was given to deep depression. He got in trouble once, this man who delivered the most profound eulogy in history, for causing boisterous laughter in a carriage as it passed through a cemetery. He was quite a character. He loved to tell dirty jokes. But he also had character. He was not vain. He was fairly impervious to abuse. He had a marvelous sense of humor about himself and others. He was asked once about a congressman who was traveling around the country abusing him in speeches, spreading all manner of lies about his personal life. Lincoln shrugged. He said in so many words, "The congressman might as well spend his time abusing me. He can't do me much harm, and if he weren't attacking me, he might be doing real harm to somebody else." I'll leave you with one last lesson about Lincoln in leadership, and call it a subcategory. It's knowing when not to do something. He was so furious and disappointed with General Meade's failure to finish off Lee's army after Gettysburg that he sat down and he wrote him a long and bitter letter. He congratulated the general on his victory, and then he spelled out his anger and his reasons for it. He wrote that Meade had held Lee's shattered army in the palm of his hand and yet had failed to close his fist. The letter was found in a drawer in the White House after Lincoln was assassinated with a note scrawled over the front: "Never signed, never sent." Thank you. Thank you.